Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting jewishinsider.com. We are delighted to be joined today by Dr. Richard Haass, the President of the Council on Foreign Relations, a veteran diplomat, prominent voice on American foreign policy, and a close friend of AJC. Dr. Haass will be in conversation with AJC CEO David Harris to discuss his new book and more. Haass's book, The World, A Brief Introduction, is a primer written for experts and non-experts alike that, in the words of former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, explains how the world really works, how it's changing, and why it matters. After we hear from David and Dr. Haass, we will take your questions. You may email your questions to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or use the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. David, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jillian. Good afternoon to everyone. First, a brief personal note. In the mid-1970s, Richard Haass and I were both graduate students in Great Britain. Turned out we had a common friend named Katya. And Katya came to me one day and said, "There's this brilliant American here that I know. You need to meet him. He's going places." Well, that was nearly 45 years ago, and Richard Haass has gone many important places ever since. So it's a pleasure for us to host Richard and for me personally. Richard, let me begin by asking you about the book. Why did you write it and why now?
Well, thank you, David. It's good to be with you. The fact that we go back nearly half a century is something I'm still digesting and internalizing. And by the way,
you don't look a day older.
Yeah, and your vision hasn't deteriorated. And also, congratulations for what you and your organization continue to accomplish. It's an important part of this society. Thanks for asking. Thanks for having me. Look, the reason I wrote this, and it's a very different kind of book for me. All my previous books were essentially written for people who were already inside the foreign policy conversation because of their background, their interests, their jobs. This is a different kind of book. This is for people who are not inside the foreign policy conversation for the most part. But my argument is everybody needs to be. And any question ought to have been erased by the pandemic. Nothing stays local for long. In this case, it was Wuhan, China. But we learned on 9/11, a bunch of people in remote Afghanistan could take away 3,000 innocent lives in a day. Climate change has a day-by-day effect on everybody. And my concern in this book is I thought too many Americans essentially didn't understand the world that fundamentally affects their lives. And as a result, they wouldn't be in a position, they aren't in a position to make informed choices, say at the ballot box, to hold elected officials, appointed officials to account, to make wise choices about careers, to make wise choices about business, investment. You could be working on an assembly line, turning out cars, and you hear a politician saying, "I want to have tariffs." Well, one of the questions I would want someone working there to say, well, is this good or bad for me, for my business, for the company I work for? So the reason I wrote this book was not to give people the answers, but to give them the tools, to give them the foundation they would need to make better sense of the flood of news coming at them, essentially make better choices. I'd say one other thing. What specifically led to the book is I met this really bright young man who was about to go into his senior year of college, majoring in computer sciences. And after a number of questions, it became clear that that was all he was going to graduate with, knowledge of computers. And when I went back and checked, it turned out that was all too common, that you could graduate from virtually any high school and virtually any college or university in this country, and either because in high schools the courses aren't offered, or in college they're not required. If you navigated your course requirements the way you wanted, you could graduate essentially with no understanding of this country, the world, or the relationship between the two. And that to me is a dangerous form of illiteracy. So this book was my attempt in one short volume to give people again the foundation I thought they needed as they set out in the world.
So Richard, I think you used the term actually you want to enhance global literacy among folks. Is this something new in the American educational system and American society? Is this something that's been building for many years or even decades? Why now?
I think it has been building for decades, but in many ways it's not new. When you think about the traditions and history of this country, David, the natural inclination of Americans, really since the founding, was something akin to isolationism. The world was seen as a distraction, a dangerous place. The founding fathers warned against entangling alliances. The United States got into World War I reluctantly and late, then pulled back again for 2 decades, got into World War II only after we were directly attacked. What was so different about the period after World War II is then the United States in peacetime stayed heavily involved in the world with alliances, with NATO, setting up all these international institutions. But, and it's a big but, with the end of the Cold War, we began to see some of the natural inclinations of the American political tradition reassert itself. I think also the problems here at home have led some people to turn inward. The painful experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan turned many people off of international affairs. So I think the default option, the instinct for many Americans is to think the world doesn't matter, or that it's mainly a cost and our involvement is more cost than benefit. And I think that is in some ways almost a natural tradition reasserting itself in the modern era.
So I think the good news that I saw is that your book is already, I think, number 10 on the New York Times nonfiction bestseller list. Congratulations.
Thank you,
But
sir.
is that assembly line worker in Michigan who's building cars buying the book in order to better understand tariffs? Or despite your intent, is it still a book for the cognoscenti?
Well, I wrote it so it's not just a book for the cognoscenti, for international relations majors in college, for people who are already there. Look, I learned a lot writing it, and I've been doing this for 40, 45 years. So my guess is that even experts would learn some things. None of us is fully rounded. None of us knows everything we could or should. But look, again, if people learn nothing else from this pandemic, and it's a painful lesson, it's that what happens in the world matters, that there's nothing that's local. Oceans aren't moats. We can talk about sovereignty till the cows come home, but sovereignty does not provide us with a defense against a virus that doesn't respect borders or proclamations of sovereignty. So my goal is to get people who don't specialize in this to get more up to speed. But look, this November, think about it. People are going to be going hopefully to the polls or voting at home, however we ultimately decide that. And they are going to be voting not just for the next president of the United States, but for senators and congressmen. These people are going to make decisions that are going to affect the world, that are going to affect American foreign policy. All of us, in turn, our lives, our welfare on every level, physically, our careers, our finances are going to be affected by their choices. So doesn't it make sense? Isn't it our collective self-interest to make a more informed choice? And again, I'm not telling people how to vote. That's their prerogative. I do hope they vote, but also I hope that their vote is an informed vote, that they've looked at some of the issues, they looked at what the candidates are saying, what they've done in the past, and they say, this is a direction about this country's relationship with the world that I am comfortable with or not comfortable with. Therefore, I will act this way or that. That is what I'm hoping for.
So Richard, if I understood correctly, you wrote the book PrePandemic. You're already giving a hint of what you might have written had you written the book during the pandemic or even immediately after. But can you expand a little bit about what else you would have included in the book had you been writing now with 2 or 3 months under our belt of this pandemic?
Actually, not much different, David. There's a chapter on global health. It's one of the 10 chapters about living in a global world. And there's a part of that chapter is about the danger of a pandemic. And I was not alone or unique in predicting it. George W. Bush, or president I worked for, he gave an important speech on it in 2005, created greater US government mechanisms to deal with it. People like Bill Gates, any number of public health experts in the field predicted it. It was predicted and it was predictable. And to me, it's the lesson to take from that is that it's not a one-off. It was inevitable that would come sooner or later. It happened. But this time we're coping with COVID-19. Well, there'll be a COVID-23 or COVID-26. There'll probably be the day when bacteria come about that are resistant to known antibiotics. So what we have to do is learn the lessons from this about our lack of preparedness, about what worked and what didn't work in the way of response nationally and internationally, and put those lessons, essentially act on those lessons, because we have to assume that this is not a black swan, it's not a one-off, but rather this is part and parcel of what it is to live in a global era.
So, Richard, I think you, like many, and I include myself, are admirers of the Truman era, the post-war era, when surrounded by people like Dean Acheson and George Marshall and George Kennan and others, they created the post-war liberal rules-based international order. From your perspective, was that destined to diminish over time, or did America accelerate the process of its decline?
Yeah, 30 seconds on that group. That really was the equivalent of the 27 Yankees. I actually think that Harry Truman.
We have folks from Boston on this call, Richard. Be careful.
Yeah, you were kind enough to mention that I got on the New York Times bestseller list. I also made it for the Boston Globe. But when I tweeted about it, I pointed out that I was still a Yankee fan, a Giants fan, and even a Knicks fan. And if that meant losing book sales, so be it. So that's pretty much how I feel. I've got my loyalties and I've got my priorities. So in that sense, I'm still the kid who was born in Brooklyn. Nothing.
You're a Brooklyn kid, exactly.
Can't help myself. Look, that was an extraordinary group, and I think Truman gets extraordinarily high marks as a president. It's interesting. Dean Acheson wrote his memoir, and he immodestly titled it "President at the Creation." But it was also deserved. It was an stunningly creative time when you think about the alliances, the institutions, the aid programs the United States did. And one lesson to take from that is that what people in power do can make a positive difference. Obviously, there's lessons in history where people have made ill-advised decisions, ill-fated decisions. But all things being equal, this was an extraordinary team that exercised good judgment. Now, inevitably, things that were created in the mid-1940s over time could not keep up. Issues like climate change didn't exist. Then there were only several dozen countries in the world. Now there's over 190 independent countries in the world. India at the time was still a colony. Now it's the world's second most populous country, soon to overtake China as the most populous. The Security Council they designed at the UN, there's zero chance we would choose those same 5 countries to have permanent vetoes and be permanent members of the council if we were designing a UN today. So the problem, I think, was not with what they did. I think the problem is more on subsequent generations, subsequent administrations that didn't adjust their inheritance enough to take care of changing power balances, say the rise of China being an obvious one. There's that, and also a whole new raft of issues. Things like pandemics weren't a big priority. Obviously, climate change, the digital space didn't exist. So the challenge for us, it seems to me, is either to adapt existing institutions for the modern challenges they face, for the modern realities of this world, or to create new arrangements that essentially do what needs doing. And that's where I think that we've let ourselves down, that the United States has increasingly abdicated the position of leadership that it was comfortable with for so long. think it began to some extent under the previous administration. I think it's accelerated significantly in the last three and a half years. And the world does not come together. One of the phrases you and I constantly hear and sometimes use, David, is international community. But you know and I know that there rarely is. What you have essentially are countries that don't come together, that don't agree, or don't act in concert to meet challenges. To take an issue that's obviously close to your heart, the whole concept of never again with genocides. Well, in the last couple of years, we've seen mass deaths in several countries. We're seeing the world ignore situations that are hemorrhaging people. So again, if there really were an international community, this would not be tolerated. So the sad truth is that the concept of an international community is aspirational. It's not yet something that exists.
So these are a lot of things we're going to come back to, Richard, but I want to stay on the issue of leadership then for a moment.
Sure.
We spoke about the Truman era a bit. In Europe, there were also some great leaders at the time. I mean, Churchill is a wartime leader. Post-war, you had people like Robert Schuman and Jean Monnet, who began to visualize not just a coal and steel community, but an alternative to continued war in Europe. As you look around the world today, and I'm asking you in a strictly nonpartisan fashion, are there world leaders today that you admire and that you believe are of the same caliber, the same capability of charting the next chapter in global sort of direction and cooperation?
The short answer is it's not obvious for the most part. Look,
I was afraid you might say that.
I also think it might be a slightly tougher political environment. Social media in some ways makes it tougher. Institutions that were built for small numbers or relatively modest populations haven't been able to keep up with the growth in population with new technologies. So I think all that is probably true. I mean, you mentioned people like Monet and Schuman. They were extraordinary. These were men of real vision, but also some political realism. And what they did, the birth of what you might call the European project, and as you accurately said, to knit together the economies of the major countries in Europe so war would not again come to Europe for a third time in the 20th century. That was an extraordinary piece of creative statecraft. Indeed, Europe has benefited for 70 odd years because of that and NATO, one on the security side, one more on the political economic side. And the challenge going forward for the current generation of European leaders, and I think there's some impressive ones. I think Macron is impressive, Merkel, impressive. And indeed, that's the key relationship, the Franco-German relationship. And just in the last few days, we've seen some interesting and positive developments in Europe, where the European Commission has come up with the Europe-wide Recovery Fund. And what this basically does is give new life to the European Union, because it might be a way that the wealthier countries in Europe can help the poorer countries of Europe, including but not limited to Italy, to weather this storm, to get through this. So not just that the EU is intact, but essentially the moderate political systems in many of these countries survive. So look, I'm one of the more pessimistic people. You and I both know. I understand that. It's the way I'm built. But I think it's important to, what this again shows you is that people can still do positive, constructive things. And what's happened in Europe the last couple of days, I take as a rare good moment coming amidst all the suffering and tragedy that we're obviously seeing.
But looking at the world through the lens of the pandemic, we have an America that has not shown the global leadership that some might have expected in other global crises. Sure. We have a Europe that initially faltered, creating divisions between North and South, leaving Italy and Spain, for example, to Russia, China, and Cuba to come and assist. We have China, which has been flexing its muscles on the global stage, even pushing back, accusing the United States of having created the virus. A United Nations, which doesn't look particularly effective, and the United States itself is sending strong negative messages. So are we moving more toward the centrifugal forces, when you've been arguing with others that we need to also address the centripetal forces that stress the global community? Where are we in that competition?
Look, the sad news is that the centrifugal forces still have the upper hand. My previous book was called A World in Disarray, It came out 3.5 years ago. The world today is in greater disarray. Lots of reasons, from the decisions of lots of countries. There's more power and more hands than ever before. Global institutions have not kept up in any way with global challenges. I think, though, the biggest single factor is the United States. To use the word I think I used a few minutes ago, we've largely abdicated. I have a piece in today's Washington Post called The Withdrawal Doctrine. And what you see is a pattern of American withdrawal from any number of international agreements. And while withdrawal can on occasion be warranted, it seems to me only when you've got something better to put in its place. I don't see that in any of these instances. Yeah, I mean, I worried, and I think the reason I worry is, one, the world doesn't self-organize. We've learned over the last 3/4 of a century that good things happen when leadership exerts itself. And there's a big, I'm not talking about imposing. I'm not talking about doing things unilaterally. I'm talking about leadership, which entails bringing others along. And the United States has performed that critical, unique role. And if we're now no longer willing to do it, I don't see anyone else willing and able to do it. The world, again, won't think good things just don't happen spontaneously. And we, among others, will pay a price for our own inaction. Again, coming back to the basic lesson of this crisis, we can't insulate ourselves from what happens in the world. So I think right now, the trajectory of American foreign policy and America's relationship with the world is bad for the world, and in turn is bad for the United States.
So if we kind of step around politics, because you represent a nonpartisan organization and AJC is a nonpartisan organization, but more generally, Richard, do you see the American people, perhaps after reading your book, more prepared to encourage whatever the government will be to take on that international mantle again? Or does this experience also expose the profound weaknesses within America that many will say, by the way, on the right and the left, will say need to be addressed first and foremost?
Look, if things are allowed to drift, I think that would be the reaction. Now, most Americans would say we don't have the luxury of focusing on the world. You saw the numbers today. We've got 40 million people unemployed. People say we've got to deal with our own problems. And on one level, they're right. We do have to deal with our own problems. But there's no pause button with history. We can't deal with our own problems here at home, ignore the world, and say we'll get back to the world in 5 years when we sorted ourselves out, because the world's not going to ignore us for those 5 years, and bad situations can get worse. You spent a lot of your life looking at the Middle East. The Middle East, if nothing else, is proof that bad situations can get worse, and then the world can do the same. So I think, but is that inexorable? Look, David, I don't just lead a nonpartisan institution. I've worked for 4 presidents. I worked for Democratic presidents and Republican presidents. I'm old-fashioned enough where I really do think politics ought to stop at the water's edge, and that American foreign policy tends to do best when it's bipartisan, because that gives us a degree, not just do we speak with one voice, it increases the odds of continuity and predictability, which I think is essential for our friends to know they can rely on us, and for our foes to know that they'd better take our commitments and our threats seriously. I do think, though, a president has to be willing to explain this. I think one of the great advantages of the Oval Office is that the Oval Office can be a giant classroom. In recent years, perhaps Reagan has done it best. Historically, though, FDR. I think FDR in some ways was the best president of the last 75 years in thinking about how to use the Oval Office to take the American people and help get them to a point they needed to be, in his view, but they weren't at. And that was greater involvement in the world. And he did it. If you go back and reread his fireside chats, quite extraordinary at different moments, how he explained what the United States, what was in our interest. So I would think that this could happen, but it will take, at that level, presidential education and leadership. The facts are also there. For example, a lot of people say, well, we're spending too much in the world, but someone could also point out that what we're spending on defense now as a percentage of our GDP is only roughly half what we averaged during the Cold War. So we not only need to have both guns and butter, we can afford to have guns and butter. And I would hope, among other things, parents when they send their children to school or they pay for college or university, would start asking people and say things like, hey, I'm spending all this money to get a degree. Why is my child leaving this campus without even a rudimentary knowledge of the world he or she is going to be dealing with for the next 75 years? People can also tune in or not tune in to this or that television show or radio program, which does or does not cover what's going on in the world. So I think there's lots of ways we can get more up to speed and ultimately understand why it's in our collective self-interest not to turn our backs on the world.
So that requires politicians who lead. You cited Roosevelt. I think in your Washington Post piece, Richard, or elsewhere where you've written, speaking about withdrawal, you spoke, for example, about the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the fact that President Trump withdrew the United States. It's also true, of course, that first Bernie Sanders on the Democratic left opposed the TPP, and then Hillary Clinton herself as candidate. In fact, it so happened that we were about to meet Prime Minister Abe in Tokyo when the news came that Hillary Clinton herself, having helped draft the TPP, now opposed the TPP. So what do we do when we end up with followership rather than leadership? The TPP was in the strategic interests of the United States, we believe, especially now that China looms so large.
Look, you're 100% right. And my frustration level, which is already high, grows even more when
Sorry.
I see people. No, when I see people say we ought to be tougher on China, and I go, okay, well, perhaps.
Well,
why did you walk away from the TPP? That was your best chance to create a grouping that represented what, 45% of the global economy, and we could have collectively gone to China and say, you want access to our markets? Here's the terms. Here's the conditions. Instead, we walked away from it. So we dramatically weakened our hand against China. We relieved pressure on China to reform. Made no sense. Look, I disagree with those who are against TPP. I would hope that the next president, and if it happens to be Joe Biden, I would hope he would basically say, I would like to join the successor to the TPP that the other dozen nations have created. Now, we'd obviously have to negotiate our entry. It wouldn't be automatic. And obviously, if the United States had some specific reforms or innovations it wanted to introduce, great. We should put them on the table. But the strategic goal should be that the United States would enter that. And there'll be some people who will oppose it either in principle or on the details. But then, it seems to me, they forfeit the right to complain about our policy towards China. They forfeit the right, in some cases, even on trade, because American exporters are losing out. We now face tariff barriers in these 10, 11, or 12 countries that would not be there had we been a member of the TPP. So I think the case is overwhelming that we ought to do this. I'm not saying it can't be improved. I'm not saying it doesn't need to be adjusted. Fair enough. That should happen. But the strategic direction of American policy, I think, again, is clear. And by the way, there's a lot of polls, David, showing that most Americans agree with our involvement in these trade agreements. The problem is, and it's actually let me get wonky for 30 seconds. In a lot of these agreements, general preference loses out to specific intense opposition. And by and large, those who are opposed to trade agreements bring greater intensity to the conversation than those who favor them and benefit from them. Now, what's sadly ironic is many of those who oppose trade agreements do so, I think, based on a factual inaccuracy. They think that trade agreements are largely responsible for the many millions of American jobs that have disappeared. And the truth is that while trade agreements are responsible for a small percentage of the jobs that have disappeared over the last decade, the overwhelming explanation of why American jobs have disappeared or are disappearing is from new technologies, productivity enhancements that are making jobs with people obsolete. And by the way, that's going to get worse now because a lot of companies, when they build for the future, are going to think about how do we build to protect ourselves against a future pandemic. We can't have all these people crammed into space. So I think we're going to see greater reliance on robotics, greater reliance on artificial intelligence. So it seems to me, rather than just opposing trade agreements, I would love to see people come up with a serious agenda for retraining and lifelong education of American workers. That, to me, is a serious economic policy.
But let's stay on China for one more moment. Richard, it's obvious that China is going to loom very large in the presidential election between now and November. President Trump is already making clear that he's in a sense running against China and describing Joe Biden as weak on China. But let's get beyond the election to the next president, whoever it is. If that next president called on Richard Haass and said, advise me how to go forward on the single most important bilateral relationship in the world that will shape the 21st century, what are the broad headlines of what you'd be telling that next president?
Well, first of all, you're exactly right in how you frame it. It is that important. And as goes this relationship, so will go to some extent the next few decades. I think abstractly at 36,000 feet, we want a relationship that preserves areas of potential cooperation, say on North Korea, say on global health, say on climate change, and understanding that there's going to be inevitable areas of disagreement. So what we're going to need is a relationship that we learn how to compete in ways that the competition doesn't spill over and preclude areas where we want to cooperate, where it's in our self-interest to do so. I would devote the time to this relationship. I would tell the president, take your Secretary of State or National Security Advisor and tell him or her, this is your biggest priority, to talk to the Chinese about rules of the road for the Asia Pacific region, for the world. I think we should push back against China, where, say like in Hong Kong, they violate commitments they've made, legal commitments they've made. I think we ought to take away the special economic standing or advantages that Hong Kong enjoys, because it only enjoys them on the basis that it's qualitatively different, that it's one country, two systems. If it's going to be one country, one system, then the entire rezone debt for treating Hong Kong differently obviously goes out the window. We ought to assert our rights, our navigational rights constantly in the South China Sea. We ought to maintain all of our commitments to Taiwan. We ought to criticize the Chinese publicly, for example, when they continue to intern more than 1 million Muslim Uyghurs in their territory. I'd stop beating up on our closest allies in the region. I'd stop beating up on South Korea and Japan and Australia, but instead work with them on forging a common policy towards China. Same thing with Europe. Also, one other thing, David, I would basically understand that it's not enough to be anti-China. We need to be pro-American. Let's compete with China. I am confident that we can outcompete China or anyone else. What would that mean? That would mean devoting more federal money to basic research. Why are we devoting only a fraction of the money we used to do? Let's reform our immigration system. Let's attract and keep the most talented people from around the world in the United States. Look how many of the top Fortune companies have their roots in immigrants or the children of immigrants. Let's improve K through 12 education. The one thing we know that every American experiences is K through 10. Why isn't that better? Why isn't our infrastructure better? I could go on and on. So I would basically say we should, have a realistic relationship with China, cooperate where we can, compete where we must, and let's fix ourselves so we are in a better position to compete.
Okay. Richard, I'm going to ask you 2 more questions. So I'm giving Jillian a heads up already to start screening the questions from our worldwide audience. But staying on the theme of withdrawal, we spoke about TPP. What's your assessment of President Trump's decision to withdraw from the JCPOA with Iran?
Well, again, as I said before, withdrawal is a legitimate foreign policy choice, but it's one that should only be undertaken when you've got something better. In the case of JCPOA, we withdrew unilaterally, which was a big mistake. I don't believe we have something better to put in its place. I think we would have been far smarter to work with the Europeans, who were, I think, open to it based on my conversations with them, to come up with longer term constraints on Iran. I'm not going to sit here and say the JCPOA was flawless. It's not. It was and is flawed. I think we settled too much. Now, I wasn't at the bargaining table, but from everything I know, I think we could and should have been more demanding. The so-called sunset provisions were simply too short-lived. Okay, so I would have worked with the Europeans.
Arms embargo will end, Richard, this fall.
Arms embargo ends. It's that to me never should have been in there. The short limits, 10 years, 15 years. I think it should have been, if not open-ended, as close to open-ended as we could have negotiated. Why is it okay that Iran becomes a nuclear power in 15 or 20 years as opposed to 10? I don't understand the logic there. The hope that somehow Iran would evolve, that's a hope, not a strategy. I saw no basis to, but for all these flaws, to simply walk away from it without having set the table for something better to put in its place, to me makes no sense. We end up isolating ourselves more than Iran. And I think that we've got a potential crisis in our hand, continuing with what Iran's doing in the region. And obviously with their beginning to move beyond the confines of the 2015, the JCPOA. So again, I just don't understand the logic of unilateral withdrawal.
Okay. And my last question, Julian, that's your heads up, is with respect to Israel and prospects for peace. On the one hand, Richard, as you know very well, there's been some good news from Israel's perspective in its deepening relations with a number of Sunni Arab countries, especially Gulf countries. Much of it is still below the radar, but some of it is above the radar now. Do you see that changing the negotiating paradigm at all in order to sort of create a new construct in moving the Palestinians forward and creating a new climate of peace? Or with respect to prospects, are you relatively pessimistic that any peace deal that both sides could accept is in the offing?
I am not just relatively pessimistic, I am pessimistic.
Okay.
And I think there is
that was our British education that you add the adverbs in.
well, you still have that British understatement. So I think people are asking too much of the Sunni Arab countries, who I think they are not going to deliver anybody. I think also, look, I understand the Palestinians, shall we say, are a flawed negotiating partner. I understand that. In many ways, they're not even a negotiating partner as yet. They were past one, they're a potential one. I also think that annexation will destroy certain opportunities, plus create new problems. And I worry about the implications of annexation, among other things, for Jordan, Israel's relationship with Jordan. Look, I've been doing this, David, as have you, for our entire adult lives. And my goal has always been that Israel be a secure, prosperous, Jewish, democratic country. I don't want to compromise on any one of those four. I want all four of those attributes to be permanent. I don't want to have to choose between or among them. And what worries me about the trajectory Israel is on is going to force choices on itself. I don't think Israel can sustain its current trajectory and not have to make some choices. And that is why I am extremely uncomfortable with what it is doing.
I could continue for hours, but Jillian, it's your turn.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Dr. Haass. We're getting many questions from our live audience. The first one is from AJC Honorary President John Shapiro, who asks, or says, even though I'm a Boston sports fan, I still appreciate you speaking with us today, and asks, what do you think it's going to take to get people to believe in the importance of our role as a global power rather than turning inward?
Well, it will take a lot more than Tom Brady. I can tell you that, Mr. Shapiro. Look, what I think it will take, well, let me take a step back. I'd like to think that experience is what it would take. So you would have thought that 9/11 would have done it, or that the fires we had and the floods we've had in recent years attributed to climate change would do it, would have done it, or you'd think now that the pandemic would do it, and that people would learn from this and learn two big things: that we can't ignore what goes on in the world, or we ignore it or deny it at our peril. And second of all, the best responses are not unilateral, but are collective, that we work with our partners and allies to deal with these global challenges. That would be my hope. Recent experience, though, doesn't support that optimism. So again, I end up with my all hands on deck response. I think you need presidential leadership to explain and educate using the power of the presidency and the Oval Office. I think regular addresses. Whenever I meet with secretaries of state, I often tell them, and they agree, and then they, at the time, and never do it, is I say, a big chunk of your time ought not to be spent abroad, but you ought to be spending a lot of time traveling around the United States, back when we all could travel, and making the case about why the world matters to Americans and why American foreign policy, the benefits outweigh the costs in most instances. So I think any future administration has got to explain and educate and make that a priority. As I said, also, I think schools at every level have a role to play here. Media has a role to play here. So that's the only way it's going to happen. It has to happen from the top down and the bottom up. And I hope that it doesn't take too many more costly, painful experiences for Americans to realize that, again, the world matters. We can't insulate ourselves from its effects. But again, the good news is, and there's a lot of history to argue this as well, that we can do what we should do in a way that's affordable and in a way that the dividends will more than offset any cost. So I think there's history to bring to bear here, but it's only going to happen, again, with, I think, an educational dimension and with a political leadership dimension.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Shelley in Mexico City. Many bodies of the UN, including the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, regularly pass more resolutions condemning Israel than those condemning all other countries in the world combined. How does one reconcile the good that the UN does with their hostility and discrimination against Israel?
I can't reconcile it. All I can say is that certain bodies like the Human Rights Council have nothing to do with human rights. The General Assembly, fortunately, has virtually no power. To me, what's serious about the United Nations are two things. One is the Security Council, and I take that more seriously, and that's why it was created. Good news is the United States has a permanent veto there. Not that we use it much, but it is a forum for the major powers to get together. And some of the UN agencies have real capacity. I mean, one is obviously in the news, which is the World Health Organization. Now, is it flawed? Yes. Has it acted in every way during this crisis the way it should? Absolutely not. But again, to me, the answer is not to defund it or withdraw from it. The answer is to say, we'll continue to support it, but here's the reforms we'd like you to make. There's no reason we should do that unilaterally. We should, again, get a common position with our natural friends and partners around the world. And if at the end of the day, we still can't get this UN agency, UN body to do what needs doing, then we should go ahead and create an alternative one. It's the kind of thing we did when HIV/AIDS came along. We were frustrated with what the World Health Organization was able and prepared to do. So working with others, we created complementary, supplementary arrangements to deal with the challenge. And fortunately, we succeeded in doing that. The same thing happens in the realm of proliferation. The Non-Proliferation Treaty is fine as a statement. It has no real enforcement. Countries like North Korea, just to name one, left it so they could develop nuclear weapons. So we need other mechanisms, intelligence, military, and diplomatic, to deal with the challenges when the UN agency can't. That, to me, is a realistic way to go.
Thank you. Our next question comes from one of our viewers in Seattle. When the pandemic finally passes and Americans go back to work, the national debt will have possibly ballooned by trillions of dollars, and federal budget pressures are likely to be intense. Can we expect that diplomacy and foreign aid will be among the prime targets for budget cutters on Capitol Hill? How will you and others make the case for a robust foreign affairs budget?
It's a good question. The irony of it is that I'm sorry, I missed the name, but the question is probably right. You know, after this crisis, we're going to have a federal debt, maybe $25 trillion, maybe more. It was already significant. You know, it's going to be larger than the annual GDP of our economy, which, by the way, leaves us very vulnerable in certain ways to what could happen. It's not an ideal situation. Imagine how expensive it would be to finance that debt if interest rates ever creep up, which they could. So I believe that we are putting into place a massive national vulnerability, but that's not what you asked about. The people will say, yeah, we have to now cut federal spending. Foreign aid is irrelevant in terms of scale to the debt. It's just so small. So we could eliminate foreign aid 100 times over and it wouldn't make a dent in the debt. So that would be truly penny wise pound foolish. So, but I think again, it'll be a vulnerable target unless people have a grown-up conversation. One of the people I bet, predicting who will say we can't cut foreign aid will be who's ever the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of Defense. They understand the danger in weakening the other tools of American national security, because then if you're only left with the military, well, then you're going to ask too much of the military, or you're going to ask the military to do things that it was never cut out to do. So my guess is you will have all sorts of people from the national security community come together to protect foreign assistance. And again, we shouldn't lose sight of just how small it is in the overall scheme of things.
Thank you. The next question comes from John in Dallas. How should we think about what's going on with Iran shipping gas to Venezuela while both countries are under US sanctions? How can the US enforce sanctions between two rogue nations when there aren't many options available?
Look, it's a good question, and I'd be open to sanctions enforcement, in terms of putting pressure on Iran, in terms of putting pressure on this government in Venezuela. And again, it's not the sort of thing we should have to do unilaterally. I think my only caveat would be if we are going to put more pressure on Venezuela, we've got to make sure that we protect innocent life there, that we don't create a situation where Maduro and his government and the elites can manage to survive. Elites always can against sanctions, and there's massive suffering through the population. I'm not an expert on that specific trade, but that's a legitimate question to look at, both in terms of both ends of it, both the Iranian end and as well as the Venezuela end.
Thank you. Our next question comes from AJC member David Simone in Houston. You've indicated this book helps explain how the world works. Does this book also allow the world to understand how we Americans work? To that extent, how American diplomacy is operating in the Trump era?
I say some things in the book about the United States and about American foreign policy. You can't talk about the world and not factor in the history and the current substance of American foreign policy. And so yes, I talk about that. But when you talk about how American foreign policy is made, I point out things that obviously the executive branch, the president, has the lead under the Constitution and under our political process. He or she has, so far it's only been he's, that they will change, enjoys tremendous latitude. But I think what the lesson the world is taking, and I write about this a bit, is that the United States has become less predictable and less reliable. And you can take it, I'd simply say that every president going from Truman through Obama, Democrats and Republicans alike, Eisenhower, Reagan, both Presidents Bush, they had more in common than they disagreed with. To use a football analogy, this is a New York Giants football analogy, I want to make clear, not a New England Patriots football analogy. The foreign policy of all the presidents of the modern era, except the current one, took place within the 40-yard lines. Now, on the field, I happen to think that the United States has benefited in extraordinary ways over the last 70, 75 years in terms of the absence of great power conflict. We won the Cold War peacefully on our terms. You have German unification in NATO. Lifespans are dramatically longer. Living standards are dramatically higher. And the immediate problems with the pandemic will ultimately go away. And those larger truths I just said are true. Have we made mistakes? Of course, in Vietnam, in Iraq, and elsewhere. But by and large, I believe we've been extraordinarily well served by the general thrust of American foreign policy. Mr. Trump disagrees, and he represents a departure from the main themes or lines of American foreign policy over the last 70, 75 years. For the rest of the world, where they thought they knew us, and they thought we were predictable, this is a major problem. I explain again how this could happen in our system. And I think one of the big questions that's being asked around the world, is this a temporary aberration? Is this an exception? And then we go back to something that was more familiar, or is this somehow a new trend? And I can raise the question more than I can answer it, but that's the question that a lot of people around the world are asking.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Dina in Washington, D.C. What is your advice to young Americans for staying on top of foreign relations in the world of Twitter, misinformation, and social media?
Look, it's a great question. We live in an age in which there's information overload, but in everything you just talked about in social media, there's no gatekeepers. There's no one there who basically says this is either truthful in and of itself or this is comprehensively truthful. I have a section of the book where I call it Where to Go for More. And I think there's no substitute for a good daily newspaper. And there's there's more, a half dozen that cover the world seriously: the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, and several others. There's magazines like The Economist. There's magazines like the one we publish at the Council on Foreign Relations, Foreign Affairs. There's certain television and radio shows that are really good. I think a lot of the stuff on National Public Radio, on public broadcasting, are incredibly thoughtful. And there's also, there's this other thing called books. And, I think there is something to be said for reading some history, reading some biography. And you're not limited to doing these things on campuses or within classrooms when you're a full-time student. Indeed, one of the things I hope people take away is that we have to stop thinking of education as something that only happens in classrooms. And we have to stop thinking of education that only happens to young people. That's sort of, to use the analogy I like, too many of us have this image of education that we're going to fill up our intellectual tank of gas, and then we're going to drive down the highway for the next 50 years. Well, no. What we have to think about is education is, we have an intense period of education when we're young, but for the next 50 years, we have to constantly top off our tank. And the good news is we live in an age where it's relatively easy to do that. That's where all the things online become totally available resources. And one of the ironically or unintended good parts of what we're all going through now is we've all gotten more comfortable working remotely, using a lot of these resources that we don't have physical access to. So we have to figure out a way, once we can go back to something that looks like our previous life, that we don't go totally back, that we continue to make good use of valuable resources that are widely available.
Thank you. And this will be our final question from the audience before I turn it back over to David for a closing question or statement. And apologies to the rest of our viewers because there were many questions. The last one comes from David in Miami. What does COVID say about the ability of democracies to deal with a global crisis of this magnitude? Do you foresee some more authoritarian regimes in Europe or elsewhere?
I actually think the most interesting thing about the question David asked and the answer to it is how there's almost no correlation between the nature of the political system and the quality of the response. And let me talk in English for a second. You have authoritarian systems that seem to have performed fairly well. Vietnam is one that's often cited. And then you have authoritarian systems that have dealt with the crisis terribly. And at the top of that list would obviously be Iran and Russia. Lots of others as well. China's a more complicated case. In terms of democracies, you have democracies that have done extraordinarily well. Germany, Taiwan, South Korea, Australia, Japan. And then you have democracies that have done, I think, quite poorly or worse. The United States, unfortunately, I'd put in that category. Brazil, I clearly put in that category. The UK, I'd put in that category. So what that tells me, the correlation is not with the nature of the system, it's with the quality of the leadership. And that's an interesting analysis or conclusion to draw. So there's nothing inevitable about how different kinds of systems deal with things. It really does come back to people. And part of me finds that optimistic, as frustrating as it is when I see bad decisions being made, is it shows to me again that there's almost nothing that's inevitable in history, almost nothing that's baked into the cake. The only thing that was the Chinese authorities acted in certain ways so that what began as a viral outbreak became an epidemic, became a pandemic. But then when it reached our shores or anybody else's shores, how we responded was on us. We could have done better about protective gear. We could have instituted social distancing and mask wearing sooner. Obviously, we could have had a national testing system up and running sooner. So that shows to me the range of response. And the optimist in me says, okay, that shows what human agency can accomplish. if people are focused. And look at the amazing results in places like South Korea or Singapore, or some other countries. It shows what leadership can accomplish. So again, there's almost nothing that's inevitable about history. History is really the consequence of decisions made by individuals.
And I would add, in closing, it's about, yes, it's about leadership, Richard. It's also about social cohesion. It's about trust. Right. In democratic societies, where there is trust, you have one result. Where there is no trust, you go in opposite directions. So we have to build on that as well. I want to thank you very much.
David, can I say one other thing? I probably should have included Israel, by the way. I think as a democracy, and one of the democracies that's done well here. I think the Israeli performance
absolutely
has been really, really impressive. I apologize for interrupting.
For that PS, you're always welcome. Richard, I want to thank you for giving us an hour of your valuable time and this extraordinary wisdom, this introduction to your book, which I hope everyone on the call will read. And this conversation so much overlaps, not just with Richard's agenda and the agenda of the Council on Foreign Relations, but AJC's agenda as a global Jewish organization that has always tried to understand trends and developments and their implications, both for us as Jews and for us as believers in democratic values and maximum possible international cooperation. So for all those reasons, please read Richard's book. Richard, again, thank you. And it's back to you, Jillian, for the final word.
Actually, I have one other word, David?
Of course.
Chag Sameach. We're about to go into Shavuot, and I hope it's a safe and healthy holiday for one and all.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Dr. Haass, for joining AJC today and for a fascinating conversation. And thank you as well, David. I also want to thank our audience for joining us and showing your commitment to the topics discussed here today. In these unique times, while so many of us are separated from our family and friends, AJC is still bringing us together on the issues that matter most. Please consider making a donation to AJC so we can offer you more programs like this one, and so we can continue our advocacy work around the world on behalf of the Jewish people. Visit ajc.org/donate. AJC will be observing Shavuot tomorrow, May 29th. Please join us for our next Advocacy Anywhere program on Tuesday, June 2nd at 12 p.m. Eastern, featuring Isaac Herzog, Chairman of the Jewish Agency for Israel. Please stay safe and healthy. Thank you.